and Britain became the first country in the world to deliberately make itself poorer in order to achieve a moral good. So you can take a moral high ground and say, we're not going to pay the slave owners, but that would have meant that the slaves wouldn't have been free. The people who were most resistant to the abolition of slavery were Africans.
So in a unreality, which we're living in unreality now, so this could actually come true. King Charles is arrested by the United Nations. He's taken to the Hague and he's put on trial for the crimes of England. He needs some help. So he looks on his phone, the internet's down, but he sees Peter Whittle online. So he contacts Peter Whittle from the New Culture Forum and he says, Peter, send me someone to help me. And Peter goes, I've got the man here. He's called Rafe. He buys you a first-class ticket to Amsterdam. You fly over to Holland, and then you go and represent King Charles in the dock in The Hague. And the question put to you on behalf of the king is this: what has England done to improve the world? Because we've got a list here of everything evil, nasty, incompetent that England have done. They bought slaves. They actually paid slave owners to free their slaves. Didn't give the money to the slaves. They fought wars. They let millions of Bengalis starve to death. They let Irish people starve to death in the potato famine. English people are the most evil in the world. We put this to you, Rafe. How can you explain this? What have they done apart from evil? How would you answer that question when you're stood in The Hague representing the King of England?
Sure. Well, I've already given you 10 ways in which that's happened. We can go into some of those in a bit. But just to do defense before we do offense, to defend the reputation of England against these vile calumnies on slavery, for example, the facts are very simple. Slavery was universal. Slavery, they often said that prostitution is the oldest career in the world. Well, slavery and prostitution are the two oldest things in the world. Slavery goes back tens of thousands of years. England was participating in slavery for a very short period of time in the comparison to all of that, a couple of 100 years. But what is unique about England, the British Empire, is that the British Empire and Western Europe became engulfed and enveloped by this Christian, the idea of Christian missionary zeal and Christian morality. And that Christian ethic that went through the British Empire in the second half was all about atoning for the sins of the first half of the British Empire. And Britain became the first country in the world to deliberately make itself poorer in order to achieve a moral good. Not only the abolition of the slave trade and the freeing of the slaves, but an enforcement of the abolition of the slave trade globally. No other country in the world had made itself poorer to achieve something that wasn't in its own economic best interest. So what did we see? We saw Britain paying a sum of £20 million. I forget now how it was. It was a huge chunk, 43% of annual GDP, to free the slaves, a sum equivalent to, I think, £20 billion today. Now, yes, you could say, well, look, why was that money paid to the slave owners? It's very clear. We have to talk about realpolitik. This was a time of the rotten boroughs. Britain was one of the world's most democratic countries back in 1807 and 1833, but it was far from perfect. You had rotten boroughs, you still had corruption in government, far less than elsewhere in the world, but it was still present at that time. In order to get the freedom of the slaves, you had to do deals with the slave owners and with their powerful lobby in Parliament. The slaves would never have been freed had that money not been paid to the slave owners. So you can take a moral high ground and say, we're not going to pay the slave owners, but that would have meant that the slaves wouldn't have been free. So that's the point to make on that front. Secondly, the British then went on to spend a sum equivalent to 2% of their GDP, which is the sum equivalent to our modern defense budget. They were spending our entire defense budget on the West Africa Squadron, which was the Royal Navy squadron that sailed the seas fearlessly at huge cost of resources, huge cost of sailors' lives, to enforce an end to the slave trade on the seas. That meant also seizing foreign ships, including American ships that were engaged in slavery. Also included, of course, the British going inland into Africa to enforce an end to the slave trade, because, as we well know, the people who were most resistant to the abolition of slavery were Africans, because Africans were enslaving other Africans. Europeans didn't enslave any Africans. Europeans moored their ships off of the coast of West Africa and bought slaves from the slave markets that were built on the coast. The slaves came as war booty, as prisoners, or whatever, from other Africans. And never forget, more Africans were held in slavery by other Africans in Africa than ever sailed over the oceans. We never hear anything about that. And it seems as if always this list of crimes that you often hear from people on the left, the crimes that you are hypothetically laying for King Charles to explain, these always seem to be crimes solely laid at the feet of the British and the Americans, and to a lesser extent other people in the West. And that's why there's actually none of these claims of crimes are actually about justice or morality. These are all ways of undermining Britain and the West, because actually Britain and America have a far greater record on these things than comparable countries within Europe, or particularly outside Europe.
Mm. No, absolutely. I've wrote some articles on the West African Squadron, written some articles on African slavery. There's more African slaves alive today than ever before in the history of mankind.
That's right. There are 7 in every 1,000 Africans today, according to the International Labour Organization, is a slave. That's 10 million people. CNN says that hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. There are hundreds of thousands of slaves in individual countries. Pakistan is the global center of slavery. Yet none of that is ever mentioned. That's how you know this isn't about slavery, because if it was, the people who are championing this cause would be protesting outside those embassies and those governments. The fact that they're silent about the plight of modern slaves today, which is really far more important, tells you all you need to know about their true motivations.
No, I agree.